most of Earth's gold was formed by Noah's flood. Really?
Yes, it was. The whole world was deluged and destroyed with the enormous forces, folding rocks, creating magma, hot fluids which dissolved the gold and deposited them in these veins, which are called reefs. And then as the floodwaters were receding, they eroded the surface and they carried the gold along and deposited in alluvial deposits.
You say gold formation is a problem for the Long Age view.
They don't believe in the flood. As a matter of fact, they've made up their mind they're not going to believe in the flood.
Even despite evidence seeming to say otherwise.
That's right.
Can gold really form in a day? And what's that got to do with the Bible? So, Dr. Tas Walker, you believe that most of the gold in the world was formed during Noah's flood. That's a pretty bold statement to make. Can you give me a 30-second overview of what we're going to be covering today?
We'll be looking at how that it formed, and we're going to use a certain way of looking at the world, which assumes that the Bible is an accurate history. And so gold was created when the earth was formed, and it was totally changed about, reformed as a result of the global flood, and that's why we discover it today in different places around the world.
Okay, thanks for the overview. To kick things off, what's the significance of gold in today's world?
Well, it's got lots and lots of different uses. One amazing one is it's used in your cell phone. Mm-hmm. It's used in electrical circuits because it doesn't corrode and it conducts electricity very well. So that's one use. Not a large use. About 7% of the gold that's used is in that particular form. Mm-hmm. And another use, a lot of people think that it's used for money, used for trade and that sort of thing. And lots of countries store gold bars, and that's a big use as well. But it's not the biggest use.
Really? What's the biggest use?
The biggest use is jewellery. Can you believe that? 45% nearly of the gold used in the world is in jewellery, in earrings, necklaces, watches, watch bands, things like that. So that's the way it's used today.
Uh-huh. So it's not finance and trade, but jewellery is
jewellery.
The biggest
That's
use.
right. So it's a good. I guess it's a good thing to be involved in, isn't it?
Yeah, that's really interesting because I would have thought that trade would have been one of its uses.
Well, it is part of its use, and there's quite a lot of the countries, they store gold to back up their currency. Mm-hmm. And some of the biggest countries that do that is China, Russia. US would be the largest one for storing gold. And so that's where gold is used as far as trade is concerned. But on the other side of the equation, there's a lot of countries that are producing gold. And in that case, the biggest producer of gold is China. The second one is Russia. Australia comes in as number 3.
Really?
And the US is after Australia. So that's where the gold is produced in the world today.
Okay. So where was gold mentioned in the Bible?
Well, it's actually mentioned very early on in the Bible, and that there's the two different ways of looking at gold and understanding it, and the people who have a secular view, most mainstream geologists and physicists have got a certain picture as to the way they imagine it formed. But if we start with the Bible, we find that gold would have been created when the earth was formed, during creation week, so it was 6-day creation. When did it form? Probably on day 1. In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth, when the earth was formed. Or maybe on day 3, when the continents emerged above the ocean. And so that involved some sort of tectonic activity, we would imagine. And so that could have been when it formed on day 3. But we do know that it was there at the beginning, because right there in the next chapter, it talks about gold being found in a place called Havilah.
Oh, yeah.
Which is a country. They talk about the Garden of Eden. It's there, and about rivers that flow from the Garden of Eden, and it goes through a country called Havilah, and it says there's some really good gold in Havilah. So clearly there was gold there at the beginning when the earth was formed. And so gold, from a biblical point of view, it was created, like the earth, a supernatural creation, which most secularists and people who believe in and want to look for a natural explanation, they don't like that at all. But they're the ones also that have to appeal to miracles to be able to make their stories sort of work.
You mentioned miracles. What sort of miracles are they trying to appeal to?
Well, first of all, the big miracle is the Big Bang, when there was nothing and it exploded. So that's where they think gold, well, gold didn't form then, but all that formed was mostly hydrogen and a little bit of helium. So that was in the beginning. So as they try to think, well, how did gold form? Where did it come from? So they don't know because they were not there, and nobody was there. And so they sit in their chairs and they think, wonder how gold formed. And they then speculate about what could have happened, and they make up a story. And it sounds very good until somebody comes along and says, that won't work because. And that's the way it works. The Big Bang, there was nothing and it exploded. I once heard Richard Dawkins in a sort of an interview. There was a whole lot of people around, and he was trying to explain the Big Bang. And he said, the idea that there was nothing and it exploded. And he said, nothing's quite complicated thing. It's not that simple. And when he finished that, the whole audience erupted in laughter.
Oh, no.
What do you think's funny about that? And he thought the audience was a bit stacked against him anyway. But that's the idea. It's a miracle. That's a miracle.
Yep.
But it doesn't produce gold.
We'll get back to the interview in just a second. But first, I'd like to thank you for watching these videos. And if you aren't subscribed, please subscribe and ring that notification bell, as it helps us create more content like this. Let's get back to the interview.
So, Taz, you're familiar with gold in Australia. Do you want to explain to me how that worked? When was it first discovered? Because we know that was a really early part of Australia's history, a big part of who we now became.
The really big discovery was at Ballarat. It was two guys early on. They found the gold that was there, and what happened was the news got out from Ballarat, and within not very long at all, there was a huge gold rush where thousands of people were rushing into this area trying to find gold. There was gold discovered earlier in New South Wales, but this is in Ballarat was where it took off. And just a month later, I think a month or two later, they discovered gold at a place called Bendigo. And that was a really, really big find. There were two ladies that discovered this gold. And there was a journalist who saw the ladies with the gold, and he reported it back to Melbourne, and everybody sort of took off and came to...
Oh, wow.
That's right. They came to Bendigo, and Bendigo became a very, very big place. But there was gold found in lots and lots of places. They found big nuggets just sitting in the ground or just sitting under the ground. Some were so big that they couldn't be lifted out. They were that heavy.
That's crazy.
It is crazy. So, and that really transformed the Australia. That was the really big change that occurred. There was some 500,000 people moved into Victoria within 10 years, and the population really increased. So that sets Australia on an economic, growth pattern, and built, lots of infrastructure and lots of other supporting services as a result of the gold discoveries.
And so that's quite remarkable, actually, how gold has changed the entire colony of Victoria, especially. But are there any other examples of gold discoveries in Australia that you've got?
Yes, well, there was one. It was about 40 years later, and it was on the other side of Australia, in Western Australia. And there was a new colony there called Perth at that time. And it had been struggling to sort of get established. And it was the first colony that was established without convicts. They say
that's
that.
Interesting.
I've heard it said that there's a country like in the United States of America that was founded by people with great convictions. And I like to say that Australia, we were founded by people with great convictions as well. They were called convicts.
Convicted for crime.
Convicted for crime. But anyway, in Perth, they didn't have convicts at that stage. And they discovered gold about 300 kilometres to the east of Perth. It's at a place called Coolgardie. And there was this guy that discovered it, and he had to ride his horse back to a little town called Southern Cross to report his discovery. And I guess he had about 34 kilograms of gold on his horse. Ooh. And I guess he didn't want to let anybody else know that he had it. And, within a very short time, there was an incredible gold rush to Coolgardie. It became the third largest town in Western Australia within a very short time. And I've been there. There's some amazing buildings which are there. And they got newspapers and hotels, and 25,000 people were living there within a very short time. They had a stock exchange in Coolgardie. There are lots of discoveries listed and put onto the London Stock Exchange as a result of Coolgardie. And so it made a huge difference in Western Australia. Basically, saved Western Australia was what happened in Coolgardie.
Okay, so you reckon that was the only reason that new colony was able to be established, because of the gold discoveries?
It made a huge difference, as gold does. It made a huge difference. But there was another discovery just not very long after that. This was 40 years after Ballarat and Bendigo. And so that was Coolgardie, and it was worked out fairly quickly. So when I went there, it was like a ghost town. And still is like a ghost town. If you look at the population there, it's sort of about 500 or something like that. But it was once an enormous place. But the centre moved about 40 kilometres to the east from there, where there were some guys. They were separated from their party of prospectors because one of the horses had gone lame. The guy called Paddy Hannon was the guy who was on the horse. And while they were sort of fiddling around there, they discovered gold in amongst the dirt it's a very dry place.
So that's not the normal place you find gold, I'm assuming.
Well, you do, but you don't normally expect to find it there. But they had their eyes set out for it, and as a result of that find, it produced another incredible big gold rush to Kalgoorlie. It's a little bit different from Victoria, because Victoria, the countryside is very, it can be used for grazing and farming and that sort of thing. But in Kalgoorlie, the place is really dry, very little rainfall. And so after the discovery at Kalgoorlie, they set up a great big pumping station, pumping from a place near Perth, 300 kilometres up into Kalgoorlie, and they pump water up there. And it's that pumping station, and that gear is still there.
Really? And so you mentioned you visited all of these towns. Tell me, did you live in Western Australia for a time? Where were you based? How did you end up there?
Well, I lived in Kalgoorlie. My father worked on the mines there, and he was there for quite a while, something like nearly 20 years, and I was there until I was 8. And I used to enjoy looking around the mines and the machinery and that. Probably is a bit dangerous when you think about it.
I was going to say.
And they used to have a place where machinery is disposed of as a scrap heaps and that. And I used to wander around and look at it. And I'd walk through the mine to go to the shops. They had these great big gantries, big poppet heads they call them, with wheels on the top. And these they would have big steel cables, and they would drop these cages, they were called. They're like lifts. They would drop them into the mine, and they would take people down or trucks down and that. And I'd watch that. I'm surprised that I survived, actually.
Because they're like fencing around the holes, or they're just straight into the ground?
Well, we just walked around the holes. We couldn't actually look into the holes, but there was not a lot of strong fencing around the mine area.
That's crazy. And so, obviously you lived in a mining town, and so you know about more of the mining stuff. You've been telling me about gold discoveries. They seem to have followed, a very specific sort of, pattern that you were looking at. What's the pattern that you're noticing with the gold?
Well, to start with, it was just random. People would know that gold was found in the area, and they'd go out and sort of hunt around and see if they could find it. And some people were very fortunate and did find it, became very wealthy as a result of it. And so that was the pattern. And then geologists came into the scene, and they started to try to figure out the sort of what you'd expect to find, what you'd look for. And so as a result of that, they would take samples of the surface soils and they would test them and see if it contained any gold. And so that's the way they have done gold exploration since then. Although there's been a change as a result of something in the last 20 years which occurred about understanding how gold formed. So that's very interesting.
What's the change?
The change, well, what happened, there was a mine in Canada where they did some research in it, and they found these gold veins which contained an incredible amount of gold, very high concentrations. And it was called the Brucejack mine in Canada. And so people were sort of thinking, how does it get to be such concentrated gold? Because the way they think about the formation of gold, they imagine that there's fluids under the earth. So you have this movement of the earth, and it folds the earth, and it produces, it melts rock, and this rock's called magma, and it pushes up into the earth and forms great big plutons, they call them, and that's where you get granite from and other sorts of things. Now, these plutons are very hot. They've got lots of hot fluids, and the idea is that these hot, enormous areas of molten underground oceans of magma, they got lots of fluids, and these fluids dissolve the gold, and they carry it up into the cracks which are in the rock. And that illustrates really the effect of Noah's flood, which produces these cracks, which folds the crust of the earth, and which squeezes out the fluids and allows it to go through. And so the gold in these fluids passes through these cracks in the earth, and eventually the fluids precipitate, or they solidify, forming quartz veins. And in the quartz veins, there's gold. And so that's the idea as to how it formed. But fluids don't dissolve a lot of gold. It's sort of parts per billion, which is not much at all. Whereas the typical gold deposits are 1,000 times more concentrated. You've got parts per million on the gold deposits. And the idea is, how did it get to be so concentrated? Well, that's what they discovered at Brucejack mine in Canada, is that they discovered that the gold isn't actually dissolved in the fluid. It's really tiny grains of gold. They're called nanoparticles. And
so small you can't actually see them. So
you can't
people were
actually
looking
see
around.
them. That's right. But they use these very high magnification microscopes and that sort of thing, and they were able to see the grains. And they're so fine that they don't settle out of the fluid, out of the liquid, so they just get carried along. It's a bit like milk. Milk's got a very fine little globules of fat in it. So
is there a scientific name for that?
It's called a colloid. And what happens is the fat in the milk sits in there, and it's mixed in, and you can't see it. But if it goes sour, the milk can curdle, and this fat comes together in lumps, and it forms other things from milk. Same thing with the gold, is if there's a change in the chemistry, the pH, or if there's a change in the pressure, or if something else gets dissolved in the liquid, the little fine particles of gold clump together, and they form these flock. It's called flocculate. That's what it's called, and they form these flocks of gold, and these gold then gets caught into the cracks which are in the rock, and you can get some very, very high concentration of gold in these veins, and they're called Bonanza veins, which if you discover them, it's very rich. So that's That's the new idea on how gold forms. It isn't the idea is it doesn't come from being dissolved, but it rather comes from these fine particles. And it's very interesting because when the conditions change, these flocks, they can form very quickly, within days. So we're not talking about like to get gold out of solution, it takes, weeks and years and decades like that. But it can happen just very, very quickly and form very quickly.
Interesting.
And that, of course, is, that fits in with the concept of the catastrophe of Noah's flood, which was a 1-year event. And so things happen quickly there. And it's interesting that as people discover these things and explore these things, they discover geological processes actually happen very quickly.
Hope you're enjoying the interview so far. We'll jump back in shortly, but real quick, imagine bringing this life-changing message to your church or community. This is exactly what we do. We present at close to 1,000 events each year. So many people struggle with how science and the Bible fit together, and it becomes a genuine stumbling block to their faith. But our speakers present satisfying answers that really make sense. We've received hundreds, possibly thousands of testimonies from people who have had their lives changed through our speaking ministry. If you'd like that for your congregation or community, then use the link in the description and contact us today.
All right, so you've been talking about this new discovery that's been made, and you're saying that this really brings up that gold can be made in a very short time rather than a very long time, which has been previously assumed. We've been talking about flocculation. What specifically are the processes that lead to flocculation?
Well, change in chemical conditions, change in the pH, or change in the solution, what's dissolved in the solution. And it's very interesting. They say that the one big factor is the presence of seawater. And which is very interesting. So the idea is you have the sediments which are being deposited, and then you have the movements of the Earth's crust, which produces these cracks, which the fluids get into, and it flocculates. And what causes that is seawater, which gets down, and that gets down there because of movements in the crust. It's like a pump. So the earthquake, you have an earthquake, and if that will sort of push the rocks together. And when you have an earthquake, it often happens, you have aftershocks. It often happens in a sequence of events, repeated things. Like the earthquake is caused by the pressure in the earth, stress building up, and it builds up and then it releases because it slips. And then it continues to build up and it slips again. So you have this repeated pulses of seawater getting pushed down into the fluids underneath, which have got the gold particles in it. And that's what causes it to flocculate, the seawater. And of course, you could sort of think, well, does that remind you of anything? It sounds just like the sort of things you'd expect from Noah's flood, these rapid pulses. And earthquakes don't take a long time to occur, do they? They happen very quickly.
So you're telling me that this flood, it wasn't just a normal flood. It was a full catastrophic event, and you're thinking global worldwide flood is a very valid explanation for this.
That's exactly right. And the Bible describes the flood. It lasted 1 year. And, of course, it describes the size of the ark, which has got all the animals on it to preserve the animals. And there was people as well. And it talks about how the water rose, and it rose for 5 months. The high mountains, every high mountain under the entire heavens where they could see was covered. And then it took 2.5 months for the waters to start to go down before the other mountains appeared. So it was an enormous event. And when you connect it with the geology, you can see enormous folds in the strata, and you can see the tops of the strata have been eroded away. And then you can see other stuff has been washed in on top of it. So they call this folding of the strata, they say, oh, that looks like a mountain building episode. and that's a word called orogeny. And so they have these huge movements of the crust, and that's when the fluids are created, when magma's created, when the fluids gets pushed up through the cracks are formed, and a lot of erosion occurs with the waters at this time. So you have these orogenies, and a number of these occurred as the waters of Noah's flood were increasing on the earth. So it was an enormous catastrophe. I don't think people realise just how big it was. And so,
how do you, like, from an evolutionary perspective, how do you explain such big changes?
well, they think
Because they don't believe in a flood, do they?
They don't believe in the flood. That's right. As a matter of fact, they've made up their mind they're not going to believe in the flood. And basically the geological societies and that's sort of an unwritten rule, is that you cannot invoke the flood, or you cannot even invoke too big a catastrophe.
Oh.
And so...
Even despite evidence seeming to say otherwise.
That's right. They would say it looks like it's very rapid, but there must be a different explanation. So they would look for different explanations because they are committed to this slow and gradual processes, which, of course, that's why they talk about millions of years, because they're committed to that. So it's not radioactive dating, which showed that the Earth was millions of years old. It was this assumption which was made and which they're committed to. So that's invoked into the gold exploration processes and that sort of thing. And that's why this Bonanza gold, they didn't discover it. You know, they hadn't really thought that it could happen quickly. But now there's been very good research done on that. And so they're incorporating that into their various models, this Bonanza gold. And it changes the way they look for gold.
Ah,
So
okay.
isn't it amazing, like how, people go along the same sort of process until somebody makes a discovery and it changes their worldview, and they start looking for different things and they can discover different things. So they're looking for cracks, they're looking for broken rock, they're looking for changes, rapid changes, in the way gold is deposited, to be able to find evidence of these Bonanza deposits. And they've found a lot. In Ballarat, they've found Bonanza deposits in that area. Re-exploring old mine places where it's been mined before, they're discovering new things because of the new lens, the new sort of interpretive worldview that they're using, and to discover these Bonanza deposits.
That's really interesting that you would say that. So what you're telling me is that there seems to be a difference in how people see the world. It's a difference between how you interpret, say, origin stories, because you would interpret it based on the Bible, and then they're interpreting it based on millions of years belief system. So you're saying that there's, according to someone's belief system, there's two scenarios.
That's right. That's exactly right. So you see the evidence, and according to their belief system, a person will then start to construct a scenario, to construct how it could possibly happen. And with that, they then start looking at the different details and testing it, and they sometimes often find things which don't work, but they don't abandon the scenario. What they do is they say, this needs more research. And so we get more funds, we do more research, trying to look for ways to explain these problems, these conundrums that come out. And so that occurs in the exploration for gold.
So, Tas, you mentioned that you are there's a creation stance and a evolutionistic stance. Why do you take the creation stance?
Well, I guess you might say experience that our understanding of the Bible is it makes sense of the world. It makes sense personally and a connection with who Jesus is. So that's part of why we think the Bible is true. And then as you explore and reach out beyond that, you find that it works in other places as well. So that's what a worldview is like. It's the same with the naturalistic worldview or the evolutionary worldview. people who take that worldview, they believe it and accept it with inadequate information, as everybody does. We don't have all the facts, so we make assumptions. And so that's what they do. They don't know if it's going to work. And whenever they encounter a problem, they basically say, we'll work it through. It doesn't worry them because they have made this sort of commitment to this worldview. And it's the same with when you start with the Bible. You make this commitment to it. And it does say, there's various places in the Bible where it talks about itself. And one place it says, your word is a lamp to my feet, a light to my path. In other words, it shows me the way ahead. It puts light on the things that I'm thinking about and understanding. And so that's really the way the Bible works. And that's why it's an important thing to understand how, that gold can be explained from the Bible. And that gives confidence to persist with it. And so that's really why we start with the Bible. And when we've sort of started geologically, we find that it does fit. It explains a lot of things. It explains the way the sediments were laid down. It explains the surface of the earth. It explains how it happened quickly. There's a lot of evidence for it happening quickly. And so that's really the way we go with it there. But when it comes to gold, there's two explanations, as we said. And the biblical one is that God created the gold during that creation week. So gold was there at the beginning, and then the flood reworked it. So that's the basic idea of how that happened. But when the person who doesn't believe in God, doesn't believe that God created, they have to explain it. And so it comes back to, I think we mentioned it, the Big Bang, where it starts with nothing. So they start with that, but then where does the gold come from? And so they've come up with scenarios that say, well, it must have been when the first stars formed. Well, of course, the first stars are not going to form from gas. If you have a spray can and you spray, the gas disperses. And how does it come together? Well, they don't explain that. So the stars come together and then they eventually start nuclear reactions.
Okay.
And the nuclear reactions, they make the heavier elements heavier than helium, but the nuclear reactions don't go beyond about the level of iron. And so the question is, well, how do we get gold, which has got a higher atomic weight than iron? And so then they say, well, it must have been during when these stars used up all their nuclear fuel and over millions of years, and they exploded in a supernova.
Okay.
But that doesn't produce much gold, very tiny bit. Well, then it must have been when the remains of these supernova, which are called neutron stars, there must have been two of them collided together, and the energy of that produced gold. And so it's a scenario that just goes on, and you sort of think, well, how can you ever prove it's wrong? When somebody comes up with a story, and then you say, well, what about this? And then they come up with another story to cover that. And so it's lots of miraculous, far-fetched explanations in there to get the origin of gold. And then you've got to get it on the earth.
Oh, boy.
And how did it get onto the earth? Oh, it came on meteorites. And so that's the story. And that's why, have you heard the saying that we are stardust?
Yeah, I have. They say it like it's super inspirational. So that's where I've heard it before. But...
Yeah, super inspirational. It's really cute. It was first mentioned by a guy called Carl Sagan in a book about the cosmos. And so he's expressing that idea as to where these heavier elements came from. And so that's why we are stardust. But the biblical view doesn't say that. It doesn't say the earth was formed from stardust.
Yep.
It was formed complete at the beginning, miraculously, supernaturally. And the first people were formed, God formed them, let us make man in our image. And so we were formed not from apes, but special creation by the Creator in his image. And so you said super inspirational.
Well, I was going to say that compared to that, maybe not.
Maybe not. Maybe not. That's right.
Yeah.
And so that sort of illustrates something of the, how would you say, the relevance of these different worldviews, and how the biblical worldview makes just changes our whole understanding about ourselves.
Because we're made with a purpose then.
Made with a purpose.
Because if you're just made from stardust, it sounds inspirational, but there's no purpose behind it. It's accidental.
That's right.
Whereas if you're made in the image of God as a human being, then there's a purpose and there's a reason and life has value.
That's right. Isn't that amazing? How such a stardust sounds so inspirational, sounds so cute, and yet it's got these implications which lead to nothingness. Yeah. And I heard somebody say we were made from stardust by random processes, and I think it was Neil deGrasse Tyson said this, by random processes, and here we are trying to figure out what it's all about. That's what he said.
Oh.
And whereas the Word of God, the Bible, explains where we came from, and that gives us understanding of who God is, of who we are, our purpose, and makes and what the issue in the world is, why there's problems with death and suffering and wars and arguments. You know, we live in a world where there's disease, and so the Bible actually makes sense of that, because it explains how that God made a good world at the beginning, but it's been spoiled by man's rebellion, going his own way, which is called sin, and that needed to be dealt with, is why Jesus came. So that's really, it all comes from gold, and that's
fascinating.
And it's interesting, that was one of the gifts, wasn't it? That Jesus was given gold, frankincense, and myrrh. The wise men came and brought it to Christ.
Wow.
And I think, well, they might have used that to be able to survive on while they had fled to Egypt as refugees to escape the political persecution of Herod. So it could have been that gold which helped them through.
Wow. Yeah, see, that's crazy because, I don't know, in my generation and these, younger people, I've noticed that this impact of a worldview that means that we have no purpose leaves a lot of us feeling very lost. And so, your explanation of there is evidence, valid evidence, for us being made with a purpose to do what we need to do, and that we can find that purpose, that it's there in God's word for us. That's very inspirational. You've been talking all this time about creation and biblical processes for geology. You've got here some materials. Do you want to tell me about them?
Yeah, I'd be very happy to. Annalise, this is Creation Magazine. I love Creation Magazine. It's comes out 4 times a year, but it covers the stuff which people would like to know about. They might be thinking, I'm not a scientist. I don't want to be able to go through all heavy stuff. So this is very simple, colourful, easy to read, and it's particularly aimed for families. And so Creation Magazine, we have some research scientists who subscribe to this. They say they learn a lot from it.
Really?
So it covers everything, and it's very, very good for families. Now, anybody that subscribes to this, at this time, we have a free video resource. This is a picture of what it looks like, but it's a video download, and it's about biblical geology, properly understanding the rocks. So people might wonder, how do you know what rocks formed when? Well, this explains how we figure it out.
Okay, so what you're offering there is the magazine subscription, and if people sign up today, they get a free video stream to be able to watch that.
Yep, that's exactly right.
That's awesome. Okay, cool. Well, we're going to make that link available in the description below. Go and have a look, sign up if you'd like to see the video. Thank you so much for your time, Taz. It was a real pleasure talking to you.
Thank you, Annalise.